Welcome to The Explainer. You know, we hear the phrase artificial intelligence absolutely everywhere these days. But how often do we actually stop to look under the hood? Well, today we're doing exactly that. We're going to decode the absolute core mechanics behind AI. We're going to demystify artificial neural networks by tracing their fascinating journey, quite literally, from biological flesh to computer code. I promise you, by the end of this explainer, that seemingly magical black box of AI is going to make complete, logical sense.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with nature's ultimate supercomputer, followed by the mathematical brain cell, making the network learn, the linearity roadblock, and finally, we'll wrap up with the multi-layer revolution.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Nature's Ultimate Supercomputer.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really understand artificial neural networks, we actually have to start with the most powerful computer in the known universe, the human brain. Check out this massive number, 100 billion. Or 10 to the 11th power. That represents the exact number of neurons or specialized nerve cells sitting inside your brain right now.
But you know, it's not just about the sheer volume of cells, it's all about how they talk to each other. Each one of those 100 billion neurons is connected to roughly 10,000 other neurons through these incredibly tiny, fine fibers. Together, they create an immensely complex network, the central nervous system. And because your brain uses multiple neurons simultaneously, it can process information way faster than even the fastest computers we have today. So for decades, computer scientists looked at this biological marvel and asked one huge foundational question. How do we make a computer mimic this?
The quest to answer that question actually gives us a surprisingly dramatic history. It started way back in 1943 when McCulloch and Pitts proposed the very first computational model of a neuron. Then, by 1958, Rosenblatt advanced things with his work on perceptrons, which were essentially early artificial neurons. But then, a massive roadblock hit. In 1969, a paper by Minsky and Papert exposed some really severe mathematical limitations in those early models. It was so devastating, it actually caused a decade of dormancy in the 1970s. Neural network research practically stopped cold. It wasn't until the 1980s and 90s that new breakthroughs allowed neural networks to make a triumphant return.
Which brings us to Section 2, the mathematical brain cell.
To understand both that devastating roadblock and the triumphant return, we need to look at how scientists finally translated biological brain cells into pure mathematics. And this side-by-side brilliantly illustrates exactly how they pulled it off. If we look at a biological neuron with its branches and cell body, and then look at the mathematical model of a neuron, we see that the artificial one acts as a direct mirror to the biological one. It literally takes physical structures from nature and turns them into variables and summing blocks.
Let's break this translation down piece by piece so it really clicks. In biology, dendrites are those branch-like structures that receive incoming signals, right? Well, in our mathematical model, these become our inputs, literally the data we feed the computer. Synapses are the connecting points where the chemical signal strength is determined. Mathematically, these become weights, numbers that multiply our inputs. The soma, which is the main cell body that sums up the signals in your brain, becomes the summing block in our code. And finally, the axon, that long fiber firing the final impulse away from the cell, translates perfectly to our mathematical output. Pretty elegant, right?
Moving on to Section 3, making the network learn.
So, we've successfully mapped the biology to math. But a real brain cell isn't just static. It actively processes information. It adapts. When data enters our artificial neuron, each input is multiplied by its associated weight. Think of the weight as a dial of importance. By constantly adjusting these weights during a training phase, the network actually learns. Visually, adjusting these weights fundamentally changes the output geometry. It's kind of like moving the location, changing the orientation, or altering the steepness of a cliff. The network tweaks these weights over and over until that mathematical cliff falls exactly where it needs to be to make a correct decision.
Now, when we just use a single layer of these artificial neurons, what we call a single-layer perceptron, it turns out they are incredibly effective at representing basic Boolean functions. If you give them simple linear logic gates, like an AND function where condition A and condition B must be true, or an OR function where either can be true, this single layer handles it perfectly. It draws a neat mathematical line dividing the true answers from the false ones.
But that brings us to Section 4, the linearity roadblock.
Remember that decade of dormancy in the 1970s we talked about? Well, here is the major historical roadblock that caused it. I want to ask you this directly.
If a single-layer network solves problems by drawing a single straight mathematical line, what happens when the problem you are trying to solve simply isn't neatly separable by a single line?
This right here is the fatal flaw exposed by Minsky and Papert in 1969. It's known as the XR function, or exclusive OR. Imagine you have black dots representing one category and a white dot representing another sitting on a graph. Try to draw a single, absolutely straight line that puts the black dots on one side and the white dot on the other. Go ahead, try to picture it. You literally can't. It is mathematically impossible. A single-layer perceptron fundamentally cannot learn nonlinearly separable functions. Let's contrast these side by side to really prove the point. For the solvable AND and OR scenarios, a single dotted line easily slices the black dots away from the white dots. But for the XR scenario, it stands defiant. A simple straight line just cannot divide them. And here's the kicker. Because most of the complex functions we actually want a computer to solve in the real world are not linearly separable, the single-layer perceptron was suddenly viewed as a total dead end. AI was literally stuck.
Enter Section 5, the multi-layer revolution.
Fortunately, scientists didn't just throw in the towel. They eventually introduced an architectural breakthrough that brought neural networks out of their dormancy and laid the foundation for the massive AI tools we use today. The absolute game changer here was the invention of the hidden layer. This is simply a layer of neurons placed entirely in between the input layer and the output layer. They don't receive signals directly from the outside world, and they don't hand the final answer to the user. They just do internal computation. And it turns out, simply stacking these artificial neurons in multiple layers miraculously resolves the linearity roadblock.
Here's how it gracefully solves that impossible XOR problem. Instead of trying to draw one impossible straight line, the hidden layer allows the network to combine different representations. One neuron draws a line for an AND function, another draws a line for an OR function, and by layering them together, the network merges these boundaries. It essentially creates a nonlinear shape that perfectly separates the dots. The impossible becomes possible just by adding depth to the network.
So, let's look at the whole shebang. This is a feed-forward multi-layer network. Information flows in one direction. Inputs enter the first layer, their signals are multiplied by those weights we talked about, pass through summing blocks, run through a nonlinear activation function to keep the signals bounded, and then fed forward into the hidden layers. Those hidden layers combine the patterns and pass them to the output layer to give us a highly intelligent, complex decision.
Which leaves us with this absolutely staggering thought. We just saw that adding a single hidden layer of just a few artificial neurons solves a mathematical problem that stumped brilliant scientists for a decade. The AI models making headlines today, the ones translating languages, recognizing faces, and driving cars, are essentially just scaled-up versions of this exact same architecture. They just use dozens of hidden layers and billions of artificial neurons. So if a handful of these mathematical brain cells can solve the impossible XR problem, what kind of intelligence emerges when we stack billions of them together? That's the exciting frontier we are exploring right now. Thank you for joining me on The Explainer. Keep wondering, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.